In this part of the tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at the database table structure, and I'm going to be taking you through each table and explaining what fields we require. Then we're going to look at a few bits of sample data. The user sample data will be more relevant now because we are developing the login system first. Then we're going to be taking a look at albums and images with some sample data, and that will apply later on. So I've created a database in PHP MyAdmin, which is a user interface for a MySQL database. If you haven't installed this already, go ahead, Google for PHP MyAdmin and get this installed. It's probably the easiest way you can actually set up and create your database and tables. Okay, so once you've created your database, I've called mine Visual Upload. You can see that we've got three tables: albums, images and users. The first table we're going to have a look at is users. So let's go ahead and click on this. Now, when you're creating your database, you want to go ahead and actually type a table name in here and then choose a number of fields. I'm not actually going to be showing you how to enter all this data because it's going to be extremely time consuming. However, the structure of the database will give you all the information that you need. So let's take a look at the users table. Go ahead to the structure tab. The first field that we have is user ID. Now, the user ID field is an integer type, and I've chosen 11 digits. However, this isn't always required, so you can choose to have something a bit smaller, like 6. So you can see here I've got 11, but you can change this to something lower just to save some space. We have an auto increment on this field, and we've also assigned it as a primary key. You can see that it's underlined here. So when you're creating your table, you can actually set it as a primary key, and auto increment is extremely important. And what this will do is it will create a unique field in which the number will increment each time, and this will give the unique ID of the user, which is extremely important when we log the user in. Okay, the next is email, and this is a varchar, so a variable character length, and I've chosen 255, which is plenty of space for an email address. I've then got name and password. Now, name is 35, this is just plain text, as well as password being plain text, but it's actually a MD5 hash. And MD5 hashes are typically 32 characters long, so I've chosen 32 characters here. It's extremely important that you don't choose a value any lower than this, because your MD5 hash might be cut off. Now, what we are actually doing is when the user registers, we are converting the password to an MD5 hash in order to maintain some level of security in our table. Now, let's go ahead and browse the data and see an example of a registered user. Now, I've already logged in as Alex at phpacademy.org using my email address, and you can already see that my name is Alex. And you can see that we've got an MD5 hash as the password. Now, when we eventually log this user in, we're going to be converting the password that they type into the login field, and that's going to be compared to this value. So we hash the password that the user gives and compare it to this hashed value. And because these aren't decryptable, you can't decrypt them back to plain text, it gives us some level of security. You can also see that my user ID is 2. However, when I go ahead and register another user, this will increment, and this will change to 3. So this is an example of the database, the database table users. You'll notice that when we created our user.func.php, we had this user register function, and this user register function is actually going to insert this data into this table as you can see it. So we can have additional users register. Okay, so let's take a look at albums and images. We'll take a look at albums first. Let's go over and look at our structure. Okay, so the first field we've got, again, is an auto increment. We need to use a unique album ID for every record we insert, and this is also, again, the primary key. We've then got user ID. So now user ID corresponds to the user ID in users. This means that if the user ID is 2 for myself, over in albums, if I had any albums, the user ID would also equal 2, and this means that both these albums belong to me. And we saw this earlier when I created these in the introduction video. So the next is timestamp. Now, we don't actually use the timestamp to display the time and date in the tutorial. However, it's always good to include a field where you insert a timestamp just in case you need this. Now, a timestamp is a number of seconds from a date in the 70s, I believe. I can never remember, but we can basically convert this to a date using a PHP function. So we'll take a look at that later on with images. We're going to be showing when an image has been created, or uploaded rather. The name I've set varchar to 55. Oh, just to mention, this is again an integer. User ID is an integer, and timestamp is an integer because they all store as numbers. Name varchar 55. This should be plenty of space to store a title or a name of the album, and again description, which I've set to 255. However, you can set this to a text data type, and then you have a larger amount of characters to store. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some example data. Now you can see that we've got an album ID of 54 and 53. This is just because during the development of this project I inserted lots of albums, deleted lots of albums, so this number will just increment, and however many we delete, it will always increment. User ID 2, again these correspond to my user ID, so these two belong to me. The timestamp is stored as an integer, as I mentioned, and we've got the name and description which speak for themselves. So that's the albums table. You'll also notice that when we created our album function, we had, create album, we insert an album name and an album description. Now the user ID will be taken from the current session of the user that's creating the album. So if I store the user ID in a session, this will automatically be able to populate this field. Album ID again is auto increment. Timestamp's pretty self-explanatory, and name and description we actually pass to this variable. So quite simply just puts that into the database. Okay, so let's look at images. This is again let's go to the structure tab. We've got an image ID again, which is an auto increment primary key. So when you're creating your database tables, ensure that these are both set. We've got a user ID. Again, we need to have a value that corresponds to a specific user. We need to know which images belong to which user, and we also additionally need to know which images belong to which album. So this album ID will correspond to a specific album. We have timestamp, which I've already explained, and then we have a field called ext, which is short for extension. Now all of these are obviously set to integer because they are numbers. However, ext I've set as a varchar with 4 characters because we're going to be storing JPEG, GIF or PNG. You'll probably know that JPEG can be written like so, JPG, or it can be written JPEG. So the maximum amount of letters that we require for the file extension is 4, and that's why I've chosen to set that as 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and browse this table and look for some example data. You can see that we've got an image ID, which is a very large number because I've probably inserted way too many images. However, this is pretty self-explanatory. We've got a user ID which is 5. This is probably another user that I registered and actually deleted their account. That was probably an example that I did when I was developing the project. So this belongs to user ID 5, however if this was 2, we'd know that it would belong to me because my user ID is 2. We've also got an album ID, so there would have been an album ID which had the album ID of 49. Again, we've got a timestamp, and then ext, you can see we've got GIF and JPEG here, so plenty of room to store the extension. So that's essentially the table structure. I suggest you go ahead, create your database, create your tables and your fields, and then you're ready to go and connect to your database and actually insert and retrieve data.